Let me just give a couple of background instructions for people, just so they understand where we're going with this and what we're going to be doing. Welcome, everybody. This is a session called "What Does It Mean to Measure Violence?" that's been put together by USAID and the Alliance for Peacebuilding. We're very happy to all be participating in it. In a moment, I'll go through and introduce who is going to be speaking today. Our format is that everybody will have about a 10-minute intervention describing and answering some of the issues and questions that they've been asked about. I will precede that with a brief kind of overview of the state of play of data for conflict and violence, and kind of setting us up so we're all on the same page about what we mean to measure violence. And then we're going to do some question and answer. I have a couple of questions already, but you are also welcome, the participants. I see we're up to 44 now in the room. You are welcome to give us questions in the room chat. There's Alexa. She's joined us. Welcome, Alexa. Good to see you.
Just in time.
Yes, it's great. We have a quorum now. So all of those participants, you're welcome to give us questions in the chat window, and those will be promoted then by Nicole from the CVP team, who's in there, and she'll be able to bring us those questions over into the moderator chat here, so we'll be able to present them to the participants and the speakers. So I'm very happy to be joined by a number of people today. Let's see, I think that was everything. Instructions on the questions. There's also a notes and resources tab up at the top. You can see notes, and you can click on that to be able to see any of the links that have been put together for this. If you have other things that you think ought to be included there, other resources, interesting, relevant links that would be helpful for the other participants here, you can also put those into the chat, and Nicole should be able to add them to a second notes page then in our notes. So I think that's everything. That's our front matter. We can now just jump right into it, and I think we're all excited to have this conversation. It's a great group that we've got, and it looks like a great turnout for one of the last sessions of the PeaceCon for Alliance for Peacebuilding. So first of all, let me thank Alliance for Peacebuilding for putting this all together every year and bringing us together and convening us. But I also really want to thank Tristan Willman and the USAID team. They're in the newly formed Center for Conflict and Violence Prevention at the Bureau for Conflict Prevention and Stabilization. And they're really interested in a lot of these questions that are being asked here today, and particularly as they're kind of forming and shaping the agenda for this new center going forward. So I think it's a really timely conversation. I'm going to hand over to Tristan first, who will give about a minute, just kind of introduction and overview of why we're here and what we're talking about, remind us what CVP is, I think, and then I will do a brief kind of introduction of each of the participants. But then it would be good to just turn over to each of you momentarily or briefly to be able to get your introduction of yourself and get you engaged in the conversation. So first, let's go to Tristan. Tristan, can you tell us a little bit more about why we're here and what we're talking about?
Sure thing. Thanks, Gary. So as Gary mentioned, my name is Tristan Willman. I'm a program analyst and conflict advisor with the USAID's Center for Conflict and Violence Prevention. As some of you may know, USAID has recently been going through a major reorganization transformation, and some of those changes that have come with that have some big implications for how we're postured to respond to issues in the peacebuilding sector. Kind of the most prominent one of these is the establishment of a dedicated Bureau for Conflict Prevention and Stabilization, of which my office, Center for Conflict and Violence Prevention, is a part. And then one of the other changes, which is more directly relevant to this particular panel, is for the first time we have a dedicated data analytics and learning team, which is focused on improving our development effectiveness through focusing on how we can better integrate conflict, violence, peacebuilding data. And so we know working with this or these types of data can be presents some unique challenges, whether you're leveraging it for conflict analysis or program design, implementation, or monitoring or evaluation. And so we really wanted to get this group together today to be able to talk through some of these challenges, some of these opportunities that come with working in this space, and really appreciate the opportunity to bring some of these voices together. So appreciate it.
Thanks, Tristan, and thanks to you and CVP for putting this together. And we've got a great group. I'm going to ask each person to introduce themselves, just so that everybody can know who's who, and attach the voices and the faces to the names that they see on their screens. So, I'll just do this briefly. Alexa Courtney is the CEO and founder of Frontier Design Group. Do you want to say hi, Alexa?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
I'm going to get a t-shirt that says you're on mute. Hi, yes, really delighted to be here. Looking forward to the conversation. Alexa Courtney, CEO and founder of Frontier Design. Thank you so much for the invitation.
Happy to have you here, Alexa. Cleona Raleigh is the Executive Director of the Armed Conflict Location and Events Database, ACLED. Cleona?
Hi, everybody. My name is Cleona. I'm a professor at the University of Sussex in political geography and political violence. And as Gary said, the executive director of ACLED. It's quite late here, so I'm going to try and stay relatively awake. But it's a real pleasure to be invited. Thank you very much.
We're very happy to have you, and sorry it's so late, but glad to have you here. We're connecting Ethiopia to San Francisco here, and I know there's people all around the world that are participating in the session. Next, I go to Juan Pablo Gordillo. He's the Deputy Coordinator at UNDP's, the UN Development Program's InfoSegura. Juan?
Thank you so much, Gary, and we are really happy of being here. Thank you to USAID. Thank you to all the people that is today on our session. And we are part of the regional team of UNDP under InfoSegura project, and thank you again for this opportunity.
Great. And last but not least, one of the organizers for the PeaceCon, and I'm amazed that she also had the time to be able to join us here, but also, and is still standing. Jessica Baumgardner Zuzik is the Senior Director of Learning and Evaluation at the Alliance for Peacebuilding, and there are hosts also for PeaceCon. So thanks, Jessica, for joining us. Welcome.
Thank you all so much. Quite an illustrious invitation. I'm very excited to be on this panel with everyone. Just like Cleona, I'm fueled by my coffee, but I'm sure we're going to have a really invigorating conversation, and I'm very excited to close out PeaceCon with this type of conversation. So thank you.
Excellent. Thanks. Welcome, Jessica. So I was asked to give a kind of an overview of where we are with peace and conflict data. And so what I'd like to do now is just briefly kind of explain where I think this is. This is all my opinion, and part of this will be for conversation as we go. But part of it is also I hope so we can get everybody on the same page. All of the participants, we're up to 61 now. Glad to see you all. A lot of familiar faces there, familiar names and familiar faces. Wish we were all meeting in person, but I'm glad we can continue to have this conversation in this way. So what I'll do is first give a little overview, and then I think I have 4 areas I'd like to talk about, so I'll set those up in just a minute. But the first overview is just to say, look, we have come a long way. We know now that there are about 600,000 people a year that die from violence. That's a conservative estimate, and it comes from the Small Arms Survey Global Violent Deaths numbers. A lot of that is drawn off of ACLED and other sources. And we think that that's a conservative estimate, and maybe about 50,000 of those a year are conflict deaths. Now, this year is a unique year, and we're still trying to wrap our head around the numbers for this year and how comparable it is. But that's still quite a burden if we think about 600,000 a year, and that it could be as much as 1.5 million, depending on all the undercounting that we do, all of the discrepancies that people might have about what is considered a violent death or what is not considered a violent death, extrajudicial killings, disappearances, all of the things that are on the margins, the gray edges, the fuzzy edges of what we consider violence and violent deaths. So these are significant numbers, and they're things that we obviously ought to be concerned about, particularly because we've built the Sustainable Development Goal 16.1 about significantly reducing violence and all related deaths by 2030. So we all should be very concerned about that. But we know that's where I come from, and that's where Grieved, the Global Registry of Violent Deaths, is working on. We want to have a number that's consistent that we can use across countries and across space that uses standardized coding principles built off of the good practices of our membership in Grieved. Still, we know that conflict and violence are not measured in deaths alone. You cannot possibly have all conflict and violence reflected in deaths, and deaths don't always tell you about the nature of conflict and violence. We know that there are increases in instability, disruptions in markets, the power dynamics of elites, the displacement of people, the threat of the use of force that isn't always become force, injuries, all of the things that are associated with violence, but that may not actually be reflected in deaths. And so I don't want to suggest that that's the only way we can understand death. Only way we can understand violence, but I do want to remind us that that is an important component, and that there are many more sources that we have that are being developed, some of which are represented here today, people that are talking about this. And that a lot of our thinking on this has progressed a lot in the last 10 years, precisely because of the advances that have been done on conflict coding, on event coding, and on death coding, including the dynamic nature of violence that now we're able to monitor it more frequently, and the geospatial nature of it. And I'll delve a little bit more deeply into that in a moment. So while we've been developing our tool set so that we can actually monitor violence better, at the same time, our expectations about those tools have been increasing. So we live in a world where you can open an app with Google Maps, or you can open any of these other kinds of apps, and you can be able to see the world graphically and visually. And many times in real time, we're connected to much more information today. And so while our tools have been building up, at the same time, our expectations on those have been building up. So we are constantly kind of saying, yes, but wouldn't it be good if we could do X? Wouldn't it be great if we could also do Y? So I want to remind people that we've come a long way. And I'm going to talk about 4 areas now where we've come a long way, and then where I think we're going with some of those areas. First one is geotemporal coding and having uniform standards for coding. So we've come a long way from just saying a country was at war in a year because it had this number of battle deaths. That a lot of policymakers, that was useful to be able to identify this is the conditions where we understand war, because we didn't really agree on that before that. But we've also come a long way from that. ACLED has helped us move a long way forward in that, precisely because now we can talk about where the events occurred, when they occurred, seasonal effects, different actors engaging in different ways with each other, and different types of violence. Where do I think it's going? I think it's going toward more nuanced storytelling about violence. What do I mean by that? I think that the most sophisticated analysis that I see going on right now is people that do storylines. They take this data that's fantastic from ACLED and others, and they construct a kind of, this is a story of what the conflict looks like in this type of environment, and this is how it's impacting development, humanitarian response, whatever it is. And as those storylines are developing and they're becoming more nuanced and complex, and they're reflecting the complexity on the ground, there's more traction by people on the ground that are engaging with them, and people can design better programming and interventions because they understand their place in that environment. So I'm hoping that the tools are being developed to do that better, and we'll see some examples. Second area I think we want to reflect on is ontology and definitions. So we spent a lot of time arguing about what is a civil war, what is terrorism. Now we're arguing about what is a hybrid war, what is gray conflict, what are the edges of these things, what should we consider to be a violent death, now that we've said we're going to reduce those by 2030. So that's all progress. It's progress that we don't argue about the same things anymore, and that we have new things to argue about, because that means that we have new things that we're trying to explore and understand, and there's more complexity. I think that these definitional problems are always going to be persistent, partly because the actors we're talking about are constantly adjusting their tactics and their responses, but partly also because no matter how sophisticated the machine learning gets, we can't get computers to understand some of the very complex concepts that we're talking about. So a computer can understand why an actor is called a freedom fighter in one news article, but they're called a terrorist in another news article, or why they're called that by other actors, right? Those are complex political issues that need to be responded to by people, and we have to have people working on that. And that kind of sophistication is also means that the nuances have to be addressed as we move forward. Third area, reporting time and accuracy. We have increasingly trustworthy and timely data. Now, when we used to talk about a 2-year lag or a year lag on data, now we're talking about months or weeks or sometimes days lag on data. So we have increasingly responsive data sources, which is fantastic and it's really good. We still have problems with disaggregating, challenges, for example, on gender. Juan will speak a little bit more to it, I think, with LAC. Just the challenges when we have these commitments of disaggregating along different lines, gender, age, and all of the other ways in which we committed to disaggregate at the UN. I think it's still going to be a challenge for us to build the systems that collect that kind of data to be able to report at that level, and so we're still seeing that. Where is this going? In marketing, they say that you can have 2 out of the 3, good, fast, or cheap, but you can't have all 3. I think increasingly we're getting good and fast, so that's great. But that's a reminder then that this is costly, that people have to be there to build these systems to produce this data, and we need to support those systems to be able to make it happen. So we need to build better infrastructure for supporting the people that are producing this data and to be able to make sure it gets out there to people that are using it. And hopefully some of the people that are speaking will be able to speak to that a little bit more. And then my last area, and this is about data literacy. So this is about use of data. It's not just the quality of the data. Now we're talking about how it's interpreted and the good analysis that follows. So, and often this is put on the users, and I think that that's not exactly right. I mean, I think some of the onus is on the people that are producing data to understand better who their consumers are and what they're going to be using it for, and that data can't just be raw data that's put out there. We've seen too many places where it's used or abused or misunderstood. And so that's why we're going to start this conversation with an intervention from Alexa, where they've mapped and thought about users and how users are really engaging with the data. And then we've kind of structured the conversation then that Cleona and Juan will come in and say, this is what we see happening with the use of our data and the applications of it, the analysis. And then Jessica is going to bring us home with her presentation discussion about where she sees this happening within the Alliance for Peacebuilding and the membership of the Alliance for Peacebuilding and some of the other reflections out of her Irene Peacebuilding database. But I do think that the challenge is on understanding the users and also understanding how data is being used by these larger institutions. There's still these siloing problems where larger institutions are creating data, and then we have massive problems with integrating this data. I do think that now, where's it going? I think that there are some advances that are happening. We see people moving across new types of tools and new types of visualization that are integrated into their data sets and their platforms, so that people can go on there and realize, oh, I'm this type of user. I need this type of visualization to be able to make this type of argument. In some places, we've started building templates so that people have a way to be able to quickly kind of answer a question out of a data set. And then there's a lot of integration happening, and I hope we'll have some conversation about that as well, which is you see UN systems doing it, particularly with the UN data strategy, but you see other humanitarian actors doing it as well, with integration across data sets. And there we're going from, right now we're talking about data pools and data lakes, but someday we're going to be doing data seas and data oceans, right, where these things are all connected to each other. And that's part of the reason why we keep reminding people these things have to be geolocated, and they have to be temporally coded, and they have to be good quality data for these to be able to integrate it with each other in the data environment. Whatever data lake, data sea, data pool we end up building, they have to be able to speak to each other and be integrated with each other. So those are 4 areas that I think are developing this kind of ecosystem. It's geo and temporal coding, definitional issues, the speed and accuracy of reporting, and data literacy, that I wanted to set us up for that, to say, look, we've made a lot of progress. We're going to talk about some exciting projects here today, but we still have a ways to go until we really see people on the ground using good peace and conflict data for good peace building and prevention, and designing around better evidence. So with that, I have tried to keep it to just a few minutes, and because I'm really excited, and I very much want to get right into this. So I'm going to pass over to Alexa Courtney now from Frontier Design Group, and she's going to talk about users and how we understand the users in this ecosystem. Alexa?
Thank you so much, Gary. You've set each one of us up so well. And I just wonder if you could do me a favor and put the slides up. Perfect. Okay, these are super basic slides, but I know we're here to talk about data. And I want to do that, but I want to talk about it from a different perspective that Gary alluded to. The humans and the human psychology present in any data ecosystem and how to contend with it. So for the past 5 years, those of you who know us and have worked with us, you know that we've advocated pretty urgently for better data and evidence in the peacebuilding community. And as Gary noted, the community has come a long way, which we certainly celebrate. And humbly, there's still a road to travel. It's one of the reasons why I'm so excited about this conversation. And our initial hypothesis when we started Frontier 5 years ago was to focus on the data itself. And we had 2 assumptions that I would argue are pretty pervasive amongst this group. One, better data leads to better evidence, which leads to better decisions and results in better outcomes. I think we kind of took this at face value, maybe naively in some instances, and that data and evidence is objective, relatively speaking, and will lead us to actionable truths. Well, the problem with both of these assumptions that we held quite tightly is that data exists in an ecosystem that is profoundly shaped by humans, our unique psychology, and sometimes the very risk-averse organizations we exist in. And as we've engaged more organizations, institutions, and communities, not just abroad, but interestingly, domestically here at home, we've come to believe and really appreciate the importance of humans in the data ecosystem, and that perhaps, this is kind of provocative, that understanding that dynamic is even more important than the data itself. I'm sure my fellow panelists will have something to say about that. But if we're going to use data to achieve better outcomes, then we have to understand these human dimensions embedded in the data ecosystems and seek to meet decision makers, influencers, communities, kind of where they are in their fullest expression of their biases, their data fluencies, their cognitive mental models. Next slide, please. This is a very simplified way of depicting an ecosystem. And so moving from left to right, we have communities that are providing the data to data collectors. They may or may not be from those communities. They're providing data, down the chain to the analysts who are then making decisions or meaning of it to decision makers. And our hope is that these decision makers are now making better decisions based on that data. But we all have a but that we've probably lived through, right? What happens when those communities don't trust the data collectors, or they give them bad data to game the system, or they're simply unwilling to participate? What happens when data collectors decide to filter out data, either consciously or subconsciously, that doesn't conform to their bias? Or data analysts misinterpret the data or have a very specific agenda, and so they push bad data or strongly biased data to decision makers? And then finally, what about decision makers who selectively use that data to back into decisions that they've already made previously? In these all too common cases, is using data and evidence-informed decision making actually leading to better decisions and therefore better outcomes? Next slide, please. I know this slide is a bit of an eye chart, and we have a lot of personas that we'd be happy to discuss with people when we have more time. But I wanted to throw these up here. we've made a lot of advancements, as Gary delineated, in the amount and the quality of data we're collecting and analyzing. But personally, I believe we just have not spent enough time looking at the humans in the system, right? Unpacking our mental models, our receptivity to change, our personal agendas, our data skills and fluency. And if we care about utilization, driving better outcomes, then we should care equally or even more so about how data gets metabolized by people and organizations as it moves through the decision-making systems. So a lot of our work at Frontier has opened up this appreciation and respect for the vast variety of data personas or perspectives and how these gaps, these beliefs actually affect or erode data utilization. And I think these are pernicious and persistent gaps, and they certainly show up in the peacebuilding community, but interestingly, they show up in a lot of other domains too. So this is just a small sample of some different data personas that emerged working domestically on a project mapping a data ecosystem in a particular US state. And I won't dwell on this, but I think it's clear that there's quite a divergence of perspective and attitudes about how to use data. Next slide, please. For a peacebuilding project, we engaged about 30 folks who were decision makers and policymakers at state and aid, academia, congressional staffers, data collectors, and we said, tell us what you think good evidence looks like. And again, the diversity of perspective was actually quite staggering. Human stories of transformation. It depends really on the purpose and the audience. Everything from the anecdotal to the systematized. Proof that violence was reduced, full stop. Vetted and validated research, not stories, and concrete statistics and quantitative over qualitative. This was the diversity among just 30 folks who actually collaborated on a fairly regular basis. So imagine if you're trying to have influence and impact. There are many, many potential failure points in a data ecosystem when you have this divergent of perspectives, and certainly the possibility exists for all of us to get tripped up by these points of view. But I want to just pull out a couple of themes that we see again and again, irrespective of the personas, and that is the profound lack of trust and lack of open communication between communities and at all points in that data ecosystem. So next slide, please. These are basic sketches that I had one of our artists draw up and that we're using in certain communities. But this first data story is really one of extraction. And I think this will feel all too familiar for folks. So communities have told us, we feel like guinea pigs in science experiments. Data's taken from us. It's protected. It's used elsewhere. It's not returned to the system. We don't understand how it's turned into knowledge. And we don't even co-own, much less own or have ownership rights over our own data. Next slide, please. This is just another example of a one-way street. Frontline organizations and implementing partners reporting to donors who are asking for data that they need and want. And yet one person said, an executive said, a donor has not asked me in 20 years to unpack this data or to dig deeper. And so there's this perception of reporting for reporting's sake without that data actually being used in meaningful learning and adaptation. Next slide, please. Data guarding is something we're seeing a lot, and it's a very concerning pattern. So even data champions in agencies and departments and organizations that are quite forward-leaning believe in data transparency and public goods. They'll publish it, but if there's a whiff of a negative story or unwelcome attention, then it leads to this kind of data guarding mentality, and where things were previously available, now they're being protected by folks and institutions, which is quite concerning because it turns data into a sense of it being used punitively. Next slide, please. This is my last slide. Data judgment or narratives. So the idea that we understand or can target communities that are most vulnerable or at risk. We talk a lot about this, but then when you go and talk to those communities, they don't always have the same labels or perceptions of their own vulnerabilities. And so just a couple of examples, we've been told to look at this community or this community at risk. And when we sit down with them, they say, the joke's on you. We have high social capital. We have access to homegrown food. We have, multi-generational households. We personally don't describe ourselves or believe that we should be categorized as vulnerable or most at risk. So there's a conversation there and certainly a judgment, I think, in the way that we are labeling communities or thinking about data. And then I'll just say in closing, just kind of a final note of advocacy. If we're going to use data to achieve better outcomes, we have to understand the humans in the data ecosystem and really be willing to kind of brutally and honestly confront our own biases, perspectives, incentives, fears, this lack of trust, so that we can be better data partners and working to support data as a public good. And I think this argues for intentionally designing not only data collection, but decision-making processes aware and mindful of the human dynamics of change. And so I'll just leave us with this question for all of us to ask ourselves: how can we recognize and respect and work with these patterns of human behavior and cognition instead of against them or ignoring them, so that we can generate better data and we can ensure that it does in fact lead to better outcomes, and we can build better data partnerships in the process. Thank you.
Thanks, Alexa. That was great. And a lot of questions that have been raised there as well. I have many questions, but I think what we ought to do is we ought to go through the 4 presentations. And then if we have time, we could do a little round robin with a little bit of discussant responses to each other as we're putting together the questions in our moderator chat too. So let's move over to Cleana then. And Cleana is going to tell us about ACLED. And I think we're also going to be reflecting on this as we go. So Cleana.
Great, thanks very much. Thanks for the great presentation, Alexa. That was fantastic. So I'm going to talk a little bit about ACLED and very briefly introduce it. If you'd like any more information about ACLED or its components, the website is quite well detailed about data access and also what we are producing. Next slide, please. So just to go over it, it means the Armed Conflict Location and Event Data Project. It's an independent NGO. It was from an academic project of mine, and it's based on a fully remote team of researchers around the world. We code political violence and protest on a weekly basis. So I'll get over in a second. So we code those events in 75 different languages, and we have over 200 researchers that live in or close to or are from the areas that they study. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, it's event-based. It's by date, location, event and sub-event type, actor and actor type, and has a conservative fatality estimate. I wanted to go over those details because as Gary mentioned, there has been quite an evolution in data over the last 10 or 15 years or so. And many of the choices that went into ACLED were based on kind of where the academic literature was, to be totally frank, rather than where the policymakers were from at the time. And it continues to be flexible and evolve. But I'm going to really specifically speak today to how it has evolved in a particular way to reflect what our team believes is really crucial. And I will say that it has evolved in some ways within its own silo to reflect conflict patterns and conflict around the world, rather than a reflection of the needs of any particular community. And that's in part because its community, the user community, is quite large and very diverse. And we found that some aspects of the data collection worked really well for policymakers and others worked really well for academics, but they don't need the same things. And so our response was to collect everything at the finest grain detail we could reliably do so, and then build that up as necessary for these different user communities. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, it's weekly updated, it's georeferenced, it captures a range of disorder, and that's probably one of the biggest differences that you might find compared to others. It has no fatality threshold, which means that we do capture anything, including peaceful protests, to acts of genocide. We do a really extensive and intensive search. One of the reasons I'm here in Ethiopia now is to make sure that some of the peripheral areas of the state that even NGOs and of course the UN are having a difficult time reaching, we can try to join forces and make sure better information is coming out of there. And we do this through local collaborations, which part of ACLED's advocacy mission, if it has one, is very specifically to build up the capacity of local contributors and collaborators, and to make sure that they can advocate for themselves with reliable patterns of conflict that they can know are both public and open source, but also something that we can help with. And in keeping with that, we have an open and transparent methodology, in part because this shouldn't be kind of a black box of how decisions were made. We try to be very open about how they were made and what biases those bring, but also what benefits they bring. Next slide, please. And of course, what we try to do is appeal to the community that doesn't necessarily want raw data, as we mentioned before. And so one of the first things we've done is to try and package it in different ways for people who might want a really quick review of what's happening within a region. We have weekly regional overviews. We have infographics and reports and briefings and academic articles, all of which are trying to build upon really informing people about the patterns of violence as they shift. For example, here we have Syria's demilitarized zone as they are affected by other attributes of an environment like Ebola's other victims, and of course about how groups themselves have really switched their modalities in the last 10 to 20 years. Going global was a reflection about how ISIS was seeking new territory within Africa when its time within the Middle East had looked like it had come to an end somewhat prematurely, and the challenges of moving into a new region. And again, I will say that some of these analytical outputs are informed or certainly discussed with really active user communities, and others are the brainchild of us sitting around thinking this is an interesting theme and we should explore it, which is a real luxury to have, and we hope that it kind of provides some fodder for discussion. Any of the things that we discuss in our analysis briefings are made public. So the raw data is obviously public, but we also make sure that even the modality of how we went about this, what programs we use to create it, are available to people. So it's really intended to be, in some ways, a nice way for them to interact. But I will say that one of the things that we have found to be most beneficial to us is that we're able to react quite quickly to new crises. And we also have always made sure that the perspective that we take on conflict is that there really is very little difference between a conflict in DRC to one happening in Mexico to the types of violence that we're seeing emerge in the US. And if we code it the same way, and if we're systematic about how we collect that material, it will allow people to make better and more informed choices about how to deal with them based on their previous experience in other political environments. Next slide, please. To that end, I'm going to show you a few special projects that we've developed, which is where we believe that it's important to highlight not just the continuous conflict that might be in a place like Somalia or Yemen, but rather to focus on new types of conflict which people might want to regard as separate from political violence, but really are part and parcel of what's happening across the world and with increasing frequency. And so you may be aware that we started covering the US this year from the Aquatic Militias pre-election. There's another report about post-election activity that should be out tomorrow. We also, of course, focused on the BLM protests, and we found, of course, that against the kind of rhetoric that was being used for these social justice movements, 93% of all BLM protests were peaceful. And of course, this was a real talking point that we were able to provide evidence for during the election when they were being pilloried for being a violent group, when in fact that they were not. It's a really nice example of how the public can engage with these data without needing to have a very, very sophisticated background in data analytics. And again, all of the materials were public for people to see how we engaged. Next slide, please. Another one is, again, taking some academic typical work, which is about election violence, and looking at one country and comparing the explanations that are extremely common across election violence studies to an ongoing election that was going to be violent. So we knew that Côte d'Ivoire, in their election,
I know Ethiopia has been having a lot of connectivity issues.
Can you hear me?
Yes, you're back.
Great.
Back.
Okay, brilliant. Sorry. That's quite common. But so what we tried to do was to use the violence which we uploaded on a daily basis against 4 different backdrops. This, for example, is kind of the ethnic divided society explanation. And then we basically did a very simple explanation of where did we see the most violence, in which kind of constituencies with which kind of characteristics. And it was where there was competitive activity between the opposition movement and the government. So rather than kind of blame it on more typical explanations for violence, including ethnicity or poverty or whatever the case, it was, domestic politics, which we all know is mainly what causes domestic violence, or political violence rather. So next slide, please. So as I mentioned before, I really think that the way in the future to make sure that we have great data is by investing more in local
So it looks like we're having a couple connection issues here. I don't know, Gary, maybe if we can move on to Juan, and we'll ask Klina to wrap up when she's able to join us again.
That sounds good. Juan, we will restart with you, I think. Klina, we see you're coming back online, but we're going to jump into Juan's presentation, and then we'll come back to you after Juan, and we'll see if the connection works better.
Thank you so much, Gary. Can you hear me?
You're good?
Yes, okay. Thank you so much. Thank you for all of you. I'm part of the InfoSegura regional project that is funded by USAID and UNDP. For us, it's a pleasure to be here trying to show you what we have been working in Central America. For that purpose, we have set a small video to start our presentation. If the technical crew can help me with the video, just to start.
InfoSegura as a United Nations Development Program (UNDP), FEAT United States Agency for International Development, USAID, regional project that specializes in strengthening institutional capacities for information management in citizen security and social cohesion, and has been at work in Central America and the Dominican Republic since 2014. In coordination with the UNDP country offices, strategic and technical support is provided to develop and improve data production, multidimensional analysis, use of information in public policy and strategic communication. This work involves 3 main lines of service: strengthening institutional architectures for information management with a gender-sensitive and rights-based approach to citizen security, the implementation of new technologies and innovation in processes and services, and strategic communication through knowledge products. Among other management processes and tools implemented in 6 countries, with 45 governmental institutions and various civil society organizations and academic institutions. InfoSegura facilitates the regional-level exchange of knowledge and experiences, building bridges between governments and civil society. Along these lines, support was provided for national and regional knowledge networks, such as the Regional Citizen Security Knowledge Network (CONOSE), which comprises 17 academic institutions from 11 countries. During the COVID-19 pandemic, the emphasis was on a multidimensional reading of the crisis, from a citizen security perspective, seeking safe conditions for reconstruction, outlining risk factors and vulnerabilities. For more information, visit www.infosegura.org.
All right, thank you so much. And well, as you may know, we already stated that we are working in Central America with 6 governments. Our idea is to bridge the gap on information management and decision-making processes that usually decision makers haven't taken into account a lot of data that they need to use, and they have a lot of necessities, a lot of capacities to be strength. And we are working on a hard region. We know that we have a chronified violence situation across the region. We have 43 of the 50 more violent cities in Latin America. And in our region, we got like 5 of them. And if we think about 2015 data, we can see that the number of deaths across the region was almost the same that in Syria for the same year. So it's a non-conflict setting where we need to strengthen the capacities of the governments to respond to that chronified violence in a context of deterioration of the social tissue, highest rates of impunity, weak criminal justice institutions, and a lot of gaps on capacity building, a lot of gaps on trustable data from institutions. So Infosegura has been working since 2014, and we have been improving the policies in the 6th government. We have better use of data, but still there is a lot of work to do. We need to reinforce the quality and the disaggregation of data. We have been helping the ministries of justice, ministries of security, the different police systems across the region to try to build better data system, to strengthen their capacities to produce data, analyze it, and disseminate not only for their common police-making members, but also to disseminate to the citizens, to change the lives of the citizens. So we try to help them to bridge that gap, to build long-term and state policies in this conflict context that is really rare for the traditional conflict settings. So we try to promote counting from going from counting to understanding, working on building trust, try to break that distrust across the different institutions, trying to bridge protocols amongst different institutions, try to settle up-to-date information and break that outdated information, and working along the information chain to build up and systematize the process and the advances of the different governments, especially when we have a lot of changes, when one government changes to another, all the technical people, all the decision makers change, and we have a high turnover that is difficult for capacity building and for conflict analysis in the region. So we are working to bridge that gap and try to tell the policymakers that it's possible to work with data to fill the gap on gender, to fill the gap on territorial disaggregation. And here we got 2 examples that I want to share with you. So we work with the clerks, technical staff, mid-level and analysis staff, decision makers, and many other stakeholders across the region. We also work, as you've seen in the video, with the civil society organizations all along the information chain, from production to the diffusion of information. So we try to provide a feedback loop to use the information not only with the decision makers, also with the people, also with civil society, academia, and private sector. And again, go back to the table and start producing new information, not only quantitative information, also qualitative information, focus groups, and many others that are useful for decision makers to build policies over them. We work mainly in 4 issues, working on management, implementation, monitoring, but also in planning. Planning is really important in our region because there is a lack of planning capacities across the region. And we try to set up different tools, such as prioritization tools and indexes, to help to think about the prioritized territories to set up the resources there. Management tools, case automatization tools, to work in an interoperability scheme between different systems of information, trying to enhance their procedural times, generate statistics and others. Working on implementation with early warning systems to detect real-time events with justice, with education, with police, and try to bridge the gap among these institutions. And also working on monitoring and transparency open data portals to the regular citizens and to have an impact on the citizenship. So in our examples, we got 2 public policies. One is in Guatemala, one is in El Salvador. And we tried to bridge not only the gap for information, but also between prevention and control of security and insecurity. Here we got the example in El Salvador Seguro plan, that it was the latest policy of the latest government, and also in the Plan Control Territorial, that is the current policy of the government. We supplied many information and many information systems to bridge the gap on the monitoring system for them, to try to detect the main territories, the main challenges in the territories, and work on prevention and control in the different territories. Here in the top, you can see the impact since 2015, when we are working with them and trying to focalize the policy and prevention policy across the territory in El Salvador. Also, in Guatemala, we have another example, and here you can see they have been lowering their violent homicide rates since 2010, and with our help since 2014, they have been able to identify the different gaps across the territories, across the different gender biases information in the different levels, youth, child, and the most productive age, to identify the challenges and try to set up prevention policies and work on the national strategy for prevention since 2017. So we have learned a lot of things: how to plan, how to work on gender, how to use the information management tools, and also how to have a common discussion between different parties and different stakeholders, all based over information. So we try to keep it working from the citizen point of view. And I put an example of Abigail. She has been in a process that we held where we identified many vulnerabilities that she has when we did a study on youth in 2016. But we think that with our intervention, with our data, all those vulnerabilities can be addressed by the decision makers and change her life. Try to work not only on security, but in other multidimensional strategies to mitigate that process that has been shocking her life and avoiding that she has a regular development. And there we have right now the COVID that hurt the most vulnerable, and especially those that were already suffering from this chronified violence. So for peace building, a key is to have leadership, political will, and try to work with the people, enhancing the data and evidence to bridge that gap and have a change in the life of these citizens like Abigail. So we will be able to build back better and strengthen the capacities to answer to the security challenges. I will leave it here, and you will have the presentation and some parts of our strategy. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Juan. That was great. You covered a lot of information. We'll circle back to that because I have a couple of questions and a few observations. And we're going to try Cleona again. Cleona, can you hear us and be able to jump back into your examples? I think I'll take that as a no. And I will jump right to Jessica. Cleona, jump into the moderator chat and we can walk you through that. But Jessica, let's jump to you. Some reflections from the AFP perspective. I know you guys work with a lot of peace builders and they are all working with data and evidence. They use it in a variety of ways. What do you see working in this space?
Great. Well, thank you so much. And I'll try and keep my remarks brief. I was tasked with kind of trying to pull everything together, not only from what we've heard today, but thinking about, where my work sits at more of a crossroads kind of between research and policymaking within AFP. And when I started to reflect on some of these components, really 4 main areas pulled out for me that really need improving when we consider the peace and conflict data landscape. One is more of a concerted effort to understand our evidence base. What has worked? What do we know? Where do we still have major gaps and questions? Trying to understand some of that, reaching a shared consensus on definitions and outcomes. I know Gary highlighted questions in terms of definitional lacunae as well as ontological questions that have still come up for the field. Additionally, thinking of consistent ways to discuss evidence quality and rigor has been a consistent struggle for us, at least at AFP, as we've tried to kind of branch into this field. And then considering areas of how we can improve data and MEL capacity writ large for our field to bring everyone kind of along with us. And a couple of things just as I dive into those, we know that the evidence on what programs and policies are effective, whether in reducing violence, preventing or countering violent extremism, building sustainable peace, we see that growing across the field. And at the same time, there's larger knowledge demands of actors who are working in fragile and conflict-affected settings, along with donors and policymakers who are looking more and more for evidence to support both funding and programming. And a lot of times now they're not only asking if an intervention is effective, but under what conditions are we seeing that? And from our opinion, this really requires rigorous and more generalizable approaches to evaluating program impacts, and particularly of interest here, how we can start to understand aggregated evidence across efforts and sectors. Now, of course, and I think that Alexa brought up such important points here. That has to be balanced with taking into account best practices, how we seek and provide relevant data, what is the individual user experience with data, generating data, analyzing, using data, and we can't allow complex contexts like we see both in conflict countries as well as just writ large, in complex environments like some of our HQ and donor environments, to really forget about human rights and basic dignity when it comes to data and use and collection therein. So quickly, in terms of evidence base, I just wanted to highlight, in coordination with One Earth Future, Alliance for Peacebuilding just recently completed research on peacebuilding field perceptions of our evidence base. We've had this debate for a long time, and we really wanted to see if we did a concerted scoping, what do we learn? And this research will be forthcoming in the new year. But, just a couple of high-level findings that came out of that. One is that, overall, the peacebuilding field supports the idea of evidence-based practice, but are still pretty critical of our current evidence base. We also found that there was a lot of competency in terms of knowing what conditions are necessary for peace, but not so much in terms of how we actually deliver those conditions. And I think of interest for this group as well, the 3 interventions that were rated as having the least amount of evidence showing that we actually know how to deliver these conditions were counter-radicalization and PCVE programming, government transparency interventions, and anti-corruption prosecution. So we at AFP have been working hard to develop practical resources that can address these different data and user needs, from implementers to data collectors to analysts to policymakers. And some of that work has been focused in our systematic scoping reviews, where we're trying to understand the strength of evidence to support different programmatic effectiveness in the field. We've recently, in the past year, released one on violence reduction writ large and PCVE, and are looking to refine those in 2021 into more deeper theories of change and specific programmatic approaches. In terms of my second point around shared consensus on definitions and outcomes, at the same time that we see this pressing need and this desire for more evidence of impact, we still are being faced with incredible challenges in terms of how we create monitoring, evaluation, and research systems in consistent and rigorous ways. And, we've also seen in our field, there's such a great diversity in peacebuilding. It covers so many different topics, whether it is something like trauma and informed care, all the way to de-radicalization programs, to mental health. Because of that, it can be really hard to demonstrate scope and efficacy of programming in a collective and kind of consistent way. And that's also hampered by the fact that we don't have consistent or standard indicators nor outcomes for the field. And when we're talking about, demonstrating impact or understanding how to measure these ambiguous concepts, this lack of consensus makes that pretty challenging. And this is not to negate the need for contextually bespoke indicators or ways to measure and conceptualize violence, conflict, peace at a very personal level. But when it comes to our standardized or higher level, when we're thinking about programming, this has posed a lot of problems for us. So earlier this year, we released at AFP the Irene Peacebuilding database. I think I've saw quite a few familiar names on the side who have been part of it. We've posted content on it within the note. I'd also be more than happy to field any questions in relation to that. But this is a comprehensive collection of about 3,400 indicators from the field that we deduced from evaluations writ large to try and understand what do peacebuilding outcomes look like based upon what we're measuring. What came out of it was 7 programmatic areas from social cohesion, governance, violence reduction, dispute resolution, perceptions of safety and security, resilience, and trust. And we see this as a really critical starting point to define key indicators for the field and start to seek some greater standardization. It's really a beginning effort for us to understand how programs are measuring, defining, and really testing out different outcomes within the field. And this, in our opinion, can serve as a foundation to start developing this M&E ontology for peacebuilding that could help us advance some standard measures and start studying some of these questions of collective impact, whether across geographical scopes, conflicts, or even themes. The other 2 areas I'll hit upon really quickly. One is on quality of evidence, which seems like that should be a pretty simple component. And Alexa, I loved when you, in your survey, when we talked about 30 individuals who could not have consensus on what evidence was. We asked these same questions for our broader scoping survey as this peacebuilding field perceptions. We had a bit over 200 respondents. And one of the interesting components there was that they found the method of research was less important than the rigor in defining what counts as evidence-based. And they really emphasize the quality of research comes from the structure of the research rather than any specific process. And for us, this was really important because we feel like there's been an ongoing debate on this qualitative or quantitative data, and one is going to surpass the other. And these findings really supported the idea that it's not necessarily the method, it's the structure and how rigorous and high quality that is. And for us, that suggests that the field really needs a cleaner, more consistent way to discuss evidence quality and rigor that would be disconnected from these methods or questions around quant or qual or type of data collected. And we're doing some work on the back end in that and using that within our systematic scoping reviews to help based upon, other weighted scales to developing some quality of evidence terminology for the field that could be more consistent and allow us to really provide a clearer mapping of the current state of evidence and provide a more consistent way then to discuss that, as well as including different weights for things that do improve quality, like having a process be peer reviewed or published or replicated. And then finally, I'll just say in terms of data and MEL capacity that we really do need an aggressive investment in capacity writ large. And I think for us from AFP, we see the Global Fragility Act as an unprecedented opportunity as this calls for evidence-based programming. And we see this that the only way that we can achieve this type of programming is through heavily investing in the development of both interagency within the US, but really importantly as well, partner capacity that can help us move beyond just accountability measures and much more towards stronger research skills and higher level outcome, not outputs, outcome measurements, as well as impact if we can get there. And for us, we think that all of these participants, from implementers to donors to policymakers, these stakeholders play a really critical role in supporting this work and creating an environment where we can put this out there from systems, as Kleena has spoken about, as Juan has spoken about, and really make this actionable data as well, not just something that's sitting on a shelf. So thank you so much. I'll stop there.
Okay, Kleena, can we get back to Ethiopia?
Oh, no.
I can hear you.
Oh, you can hear me. Oh, brilliant.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
Good. All right. I'll whiz through this because there are questions and I'm sure that they'll be more interesting than the rest of this presentation. So anyway, very important that we encourage local capacity and through that, of course, local conflict observatories. As I said right before, I really do want to emphasize that ACLED has taken kind of the opposite of many conflict databases in that while we believe very much in technology to gain efficiencies, etc., we certainly don't believe it to be a replacement for knowing something about that conflict in great detail and encouraging people to take a wide variety of sources and be able to somehow get to accurate, robust outcomes because of it. Next slide, please. And this is our conflict prediction model. Again, I know that a lot of people in this field, especially practitioners, are very engaged with early warning. To be frank, we took every early warning model that was possible and we ran it through some very rigorous steps to find out that they didn't work, which was not great. And so what we ended up doing is to try and isolate what were good practices for early warning and what were reliable practices above 75% accuracy and what were not. Because while many people actually say early warning, they sometimes mean description or they mean something about response rates, but this is basically trying to figure out on an actor level whether or not we can see expected or increased results. And all of these are simply emphasizing that effectively what we were trying to do here is take the raw data, which is available to everybody, but also package it in different ways for different communities that still allow people to understand the transparency of the project in general. I'll stop there, although the next slide basically tells you where you can find information on, that's actually the COVID disorder tracker, where we, again, I wanted to emphasize that we are quite flexible in how we approach problems. So when the coronavirus pandemic hit, we were able to kind of reorganize some of our resources in order to follow it in great detail and how it might in fact have impacted violence. And of course, what we found is that certain types of violence increased quite drastically while protests basically decreased. But that was another way in which we try to answer, let's say, a much broader community-specific questions about the impact of coronavirus rather than a very specific communities one, which is, again, as I said before, quite a luxury. But we hope we put it to good use. And then finally, there are some areas where you can find all the resources on our general guides about how to use ACLED, what's its core methodology, what's its methodology for specific countries that we encounter different difficulties, and user guides. And I will leave it there so we can get to the questions. Thanks very much for the opportunity to say a few more things.
Fantastic. Thanks, Cleona. We're really happy to have you connected in. Sorry for the connection issues, but really glad to bring that to a conclusion and get all of that on the table. The point of putting that all on the table was A, to reflect all this great work, B, to show how complex it is and what this ecosystems really look like. And Jessica did a great job of summarizing some of the challenges of comparing when we're talking about peace measurement or peace building, all of the varieties of outcomes and types of programming that we're really talking about. And I think that's reflected in the entire the constituency of the Alliance for Peacebuilding. Here's going to be my question for you, and I'm going to pose it now so you have a moment to think about it before we come back to each of you. But my question for you, before I try to draw a couple of little things together here, is where have you seen this being done well? So for you, Cleona, where has your data, not by your team, because you've done a lot of great analysis, but where do you see somebody using the data to be able to answer a question well? Juan, where do you see InfoSegura really kind of entering into this ecosystem and somebody else has run with it and they've taken, what is being put together there? Or, have you seen a UN agency or a particular actor really run with that? And maybe we can extract from those a couple of examples. Alexa, you showed a lot of, and I think those are exactly right. Those are the challenges that we have with using data and the responsibility we have to people we're collecting data from. Anybody you've seen do that well as a good model for us, and just an example? And Jessica, you've got a variety of sources and you've looked at all the data, and I'm really glad we got a sneak peek of your work from One Earth. So that's really good. But some of those outcomes are also pointing to places where we can do that well. And the reason I ask this question is, I've often said that data is an institution, and the statistical, we always know that the statistical capacity building for data, the statistical capacity is itself an institution, but data is also an institution. So when we see in InfoSegura is examples where you're building systems that are collecting data and putting it together, and as a result, all that transition that you're talking about, the turnover that you have, Juan, all of those actors start to trust the system that they're putting this data into. They start to say, oh, well, we frequently, load this data into this system, and we can trust other things that are in this system. So what I'm looking for is examples from these cases, if you have them. If you don't, tell us where you think this ought to be going, what people ought to be doing. So why don't we go in the same order again? We just, Alexa, if you want to jump in, and then we'll do Cleona and Juan and Jessica.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
So I'm in awe of so many fellow panelists, and I can't sing the ACLED praises enough. I remember 3 to 5 years ago when we were championing ACLED, a surprising number of donors said, what's ACLED? And I think that that's changed a lot, but I get really curious about why there are kind of latent patterns of adoption for something that is such a powerful tool. Where is it being done well? So what's interesting and curious to me are the resident capacities of very different domains that almost never intersect with peacebuilding. So marketing and design firms are slowly making their way into international development. And I think they have a fundamental grounding as designers in empathy. But I think data empathy is not a conversation we've had yet. And so I think we're kind of starting it with this and other kinds of discussions. One other thing, because I think we can learn as much about where it's not happening well as where it is happening well. We've worked with a number of foundations outside of the oversight and all of the challenges that USAID and others experience working with Congress, right? And they have fundamentally tried to flip the power dynamics, to work from the bottom up, and to really develop a development agenda in conflict context that is coming from the community and where the community owns the data. And even where that's an explicit priority of their programming, they still get in their own way because the people who own the decision rights are in the boardroom in a policy capital somewhere, and there is psychological space and distance between the communities most affected. And so I have a hard time just rattling off a number of positive examples. I wish I had more. I will give a shout out to IMPL Project, led by Justin Richmond. I think they do great work at the grassroots level in terms of data collection. And so I'm always happy to vocalize great work where I see it, but it needs to happen more. And I think there's a conversation we should all be deepening around data empathy. Thanks.
Great, thanks. Yeah, and I agree with it that, we make all these arguments in the developed world about the value of data and as consumers, but we forget about all the value of data that we're extracting from for the people that are giving us this data. And that really resonates with Cleona's point about the people who produce the data. Cleona, we'll hand it over to you because you'll say it better than me.
Great. Thanks very much, Alexa. Thank you very much for your very kind comments. I'm thrilled to hear them. And I actually am going to really speak about some of those power users now. A lot of ACLED use goes on without us knowing, which is kind of the nature of the subject matter. But there are 3 really substantial power users that have been also, in order to address one of Nicole's questions, also some of the supporters of ACLED. And they are the early warning systems that have been developed in the US at the CSO department, the German Foreign Ministry, and the Dutch Foreign Ministry. They've all had different specifications, but all have some sort of an early warning model which runs a significant amount of its conflict data from ACLED, and they really do make decisions based on it. So they are really clear with us about questions they have or ways in which they interact with the data, but also the more contextual or even qualitative details. And I think that it's extremely important that they meld quantitative and qualitative data together in order to make those decisions, rather than relying on one or the other. But I know that those early warning systems, of course, exist in all governments with substantial foreign policy demands. So I would say that those that I've seen, I've been very impressed by. But also, just speaking to some other uses which are similar, the UN uses ACLED in quite a bit, in quite a number of its departments, but in very different ways. And I've seen some of that, especially around migration and migration tracking, using ACLED for its Project Jetson, for example. And I'm very impressed, because I think modeling migration must be one of the hardest things in the entire world. So any contributions we can have are always nice to hear. But I would say that, of course, what we do see is a lot of people using maybe some very clear ways of tracking a trend or a pattern. We have a data literacy program that we'll be introducing next year that tries to get people to question some of the expectations that they have around data, and really test how well they know the data they're using, which I think is a big issue when you start doing any sort of analytics from basic to advanced. And we hope that anybody, whether it is people in the field, or whether it is a practitioner or a senior and experienced analyst, might find something useful in our new data literacy program. That's it for me.
Thanks, Clina. Let's go right to Juan. And what about InfoSegura? Where do you see the real power users? And sometimes, people using it without what you intended it to be used for.
Thank you, Gary. Yes, I got a lot of examples in the 6 countries, but right now it falls into my mind the example of Honduras, where we got this mid-level work with the national sector, civil sector institute that is the one in charge to deliver the presidential aid to the most vulnerable across the country. We have been working with them and bridging them with the National Security Ministry to have over the base of the information in the different territories of the prioritization tool of the different multidimensional challenges that they got in the different municipalities. We got a prioritization that they used when the COVID started to deliver the aid for the most vulnerable. So they use it for that, and also they use it to track the territories that had the highest levels of returnees from the US and from Mexico, to identify not only the layer of violence, the layer of returnees, but also the layer of socioeconomic impact. So they make the comparison with this data, and they prioritize many territories. It was almost like 13 or 14 to send at first the aid to those territories. Also within the UN system, we got another example where we designed a multi-dimensional index of chronic violence, and it's a prevention index that was adopted in 2016 by 2 of the governments of the Northern Triangle of Central America. And they adopted this index to identify the challenges on data and to identify where they needed to put the highest effort on resources and other human capital partnerships to strengthen the challenge over, for example, extortion, over gender-based violence, over the need of supplementary data such as surveys. And in the case of El Salvador, that is also a successful story, as I shown in the PowerPoint. We arranged to have 3 different peace cultural surveys that were adopted by the National Statistics Office, by the National Gender-Based Unit within the Statistical Office, and also by the National Security Ministry to design the policy and the prevention policies in the territory. So we got the index, the policy making in El Salvador, and the policy making in Honduras. I got other examples, but I invite you to take a look on our website. It's really interesting on that.
Yeah, and I think anytime you can see governments taking up some of this data that's being produced, externally in some ways, or being collected externally, and using it for policymaking, I think that's a really good sign that there's that uptake there. Jessica, what about some examples? Then I have a question for Juan and Cleona. I'm going to come back to them. It's coming out of the moderator chat, or the chat.
Great. I'll keep it really quick. I think one of the interesting things about Alliance for Peacebuilding and being a network is that we're almost a silent partner to the peacebuilding field, in the sense that we often are integrated in so many areas behind the scenes, and it's not always as easy to kind of pinpoint some of those long-term effects. I would say, in terms of just a couple that came to mind really quickly with Irene, I think one of the successes for me that was really overt and very pleasing was working with 3IE on the evidence gap map for peacebuilding and helping use some of our framework on what we were learning to inform how evidence was assessed in the evidence gap map, which was a big step for me in terms of an ontological development for the peacebuilding field. I think also for the Global Fragility Act, we played a really big role alongside Mercy Corps in helping to make sure that what we are learning through our work with the peacebuilding field informs the next 10 years of policy for the U.S. government and how we interact within fragile and conflict-affected countries. And then we also do so much work in terms of multilateral government and other NGO capacity building, as well as just sharing out and translating information from the field to make sure that there's an uptake there. And sometimes that's very quiet, and I always say it's one of our public goods, but literally 2 days don't go by that I'm not reached out to, we're trying to do a project here. Do you know anyone doing work there? And we play this interesting middleman role of, at least I do in research, of connecting individuals with other organizations and researchers who may be doing similar work and can learn from each other, but may not have more of an overt or formal way to connect. So I think there's a lot of long-term effects there. And I would say my last point really in terms of where we see data use being done well writ large, I think we have all, in 2020 has been a hard year. That's goes without saying, but it's also been a huge year for data. Yes, we have massive issues of misinformation and disinformation, but Johns Hopkins COVID-19 map and tracker, I think, plays a role in every one of our lives deeply and has almost in many ways been unquestioned. So I think that we're seeing a rise of data visualization, data use, and data literacy in everyday lives for individuals who maybe never interacted in that type of formal setting. So I think there's also been a lot of opportunities this year to move this work forward, and people are more comfortable kind of dipping their toes in.
Yeah, that's a really good reminder of when we say that we need to understand the trust that people have in data, we have really strong institutions that produce good data that people trust. And so those can be exemplars for us when we're trying to assess this. So my question now is for Cleona and Juan, and I'm going to try to keep it simple because we're running out of time, but it comes out of the chat, which is, how many people do you have? We don't need to go into your financials, but, how are you funded basically? And, how sustainable is this? We go back to the good, fast, and cheap problem. This costs money to be able to do this. And I am only directing it to Cleona and Juan because they both are running these kind of big data projects. But Alexa and Jessica, you're welcome to jump in there afterward too and kind of say, we got 3 people doing this, right? So just to remind us of the scale of the scope of these challenges. I'll say we've got basically 2.5 researchers working on Grieved right now, and we're looking for money. So if anybody is out there that wants to support us, we're happy to work with you. But Cleona, how many people we got in the world working through ACLED? What's the scale of the endeavor?
So it's 200 people at the moment. And they wouldn't all be full time by any stretch of the imagination, but there is it's a rapidly growing field of ACLED employees, and we are funded through. Actually, we've really changed our funding mechanisms just in the last few months because for the first time, users both have to register. And so use cases, especially private use cases, but also kind of meta public ones, such as governments, are being asked to contribute in order to provide for the public good. And so that is effectively how we're doing it. We're making people who either have a substantial part of their own workflow based on ACLED or are using it for profit to contribute to the public use.
Juan, turn to you. What about the InfoSegura model? How is that funded, and how many people are there really contributing to it?
Thank you so much, Gary. Yes, we have a combined funding from the UN system, UNDP, the development program, and USAID. And the program was funded at the beginning in 2014 with USAID funds. And we are reaching 6 countries, and we have almost 13 people working regionally, exclusively for the project. But we got a sort of additional bubble of 190 civil servants that work on data across the different institutions in all the 6 countries. So we try to work on pairs and set up a sort of middleman role, as Jessica said, bridging between one kind of technical analyst and other kind of technical analyst in other country. And we build the bridge and we put them together to work and analyze. So we call it the additional bubble of 192 civil servants that help us to work on evidence-based data.
And Alexa and Jessica, you want to jump in, or what do you think?
Yeah, I'm happy to be transparent. So we work across the U.S. government and also with global philanthropies and foundations and commercial clients. And what I am constantly delighted and surprised by, although I shouldn't be at this point, is that each organization can be quite precious about their space and their language. But when you strip all that away, what these organizations have in common, who are funding us to do this work, is they are all curious about how they can get, higher fidelity on local context, and what that means for their strategies, their programs, and their impact, and how they adapt regularly in complex adaptive environments. And so they use different language, and clearly they have different objectives, but there's so much more that binds curious organizations in conflict-affected complex environments than separates us. So I'm just delighted by the diversity of partners in this space, which I think bodes well for all of our kind of shared learning and evolution.
Jessica, how do you do all this?
We don't sleep much, and we are a network organization. We are truly not funded by our members. Most of our work comes from critical partnerships with some of the thought leaders of this field, individuals, I think, who recognize the need for public good programming, and that we are able to provide and support the field writ large. It's definitely a struggle and something we're always aware of and conscious of, but we work very deeply with some of the largest donors in the field to also communicate the struggles that we know all individual programs are finding and resonating with, and would definitely be more than happy to discuss in more depth with anyone. Our contact information I know is all up in the note, but I see my role in many ways, as I said, as acting more in the public good and trying to make sure that all of the critical work that individuals like our panelists and like all of our attendees are doing get out there and are used, are recognized, and really have the ability to influence both policy and programming writ large for the global peacebuilding field.
Okay, so my last question, and so that before we run out of time, and so I'm going to wrap it up here. We all would like 2020 to be over. We would all like a better year in 2021. And so it's a forward-looking question. I'm going to kind of tie in this question that we got from the chat here, which is there was a question for Kleena about ACLED. Are you going to be doing disinformation? Are you going to be adding additional levels of conflict and peace understanding to ACLED? So I'm going to more broadly turn that into the question for the same order, same panelists from Alexa, which is, what can we look forward to in 2021? How are we going to have a happy new year? What are you going to be doing on data for peace and violence that we should all be looking forward to? So just a brief one, and I'll start. Grieved is going to be, we figured it out with the members of Grieved, how to put our data together online to show that it's from multiple sources and that it's co-validated. And so we're going to be putting out there a number and the places where we know violent deaths have occurred. And then we're going to be putting out there where we think violent deaths might have occurred. And that's the real tricky part. That's the other 90% of the problem is trying to figure out where those other violent deaths have happened that aren't geocoded, that aren't temporally coded the way that we really need them to be to monitor violent deaths properly. So now I've answered one question and I've set up another question. Alexa, what can we look forward to in 2021?
It's a great question. We are going to build products that actually take the insights and put them into users' hands. So I'll give you a really quick example. We're working with a couple different foundations on how change happens in societies, but we're also working with U.S. government organizations about how change happens in evidence-informed ways internal to their own organizations. We're not going to just write reports about that, but we're going to create these cards that help teams and leaders think about key patterns in change and change management and how data can influence it. So it's going to be tactile in people's hands and actually allow people to use the insights and the data in a regular, hopefully joyful and delightful way basis. So that's one thing that I'm really excited about.
Super exciting. Looking forward to that. Kalina, where's ACLED going? What can we look forward to?
Well, just in January, we'll be completing some announcements on the Western European data, and that will leave Canada and Oceania, which we'll be completing next year, which will be global coverage. And like I said, we'll have a data literacy program and conflict observatories in Ethiopia, the Sahel, and possibly another one, keeping up with the Mozambique example. But we will not, I'm sorry, I should mention, we really won't be looking into disinformation as part of our typical things that we collect. But we are very interested in both taking that on as a methodological point, but also taking it on as an important indicator for how conflicts are being spoken about, really more as a partnership than as a component of what ACLED will do.
Excellent. Sounds like a good call for partnership. Juan, where's InfoSegura going?
Thank you so much, Gary. Yes, on 2021, we are expecting to have a lot of innovation and innovative solutions to try to tackle the challenges on data, how to build stronger partnerships at national level with other institutions such as education, health ministries, forensics labs, and statistical offices that right now aren't part of our project. Also in the local level, we've got a lot of challenges and we're expecting to close that gap with the local level. And also we got a challenge with the regional network of civil society that InfoSegura funded, that is CONOCE, to reinforce the training program and the investigation program that they got regionally across 14 institutions of the academic sector and the private sector, trying to produce more investigation and the impacts of COVID-19, trying to look of those who were already suffering for violence, how are they in the future and how can we build back better after the COVID-19. So we will be seeking some additional funds to help us to do that and grow up in the justice sector and try to continue to do what we are doing, that is produce good information and engage all the decision makers across the 6 countries that we have been engaging till today.
Jessica?
Great. 2021, very excited. I'm happy to say that we're bringing on a researcher to help us update Irene and get new content in there. So she's going to be, moving forward, and hopefully we'll get her digitized one day soon. Also working with an amazing new researcher to lead our peer learning community on the evaluation of interreligious dialogue and getting a lot of great learnings there in terms of what it means to measure and prove impact within this kind of difficult field. And then we're working really hard to continue our systematic scoping reviews and are looking to refine a few more in the coming year that really can help focus and provide insight to some of our other work.
Excellent. And then I'll put Tristan on the spot. Where's CVP going? What can we look forward to in the next year, Tristan?
Well, as I think I mentioned earlier on, we're really just getting our feet under us as a new team and helping to support the overall Bureau of Conflict Prevention and Stabilization. This has come up in a lot of these other panels. There's some major policy initiatives that require some deep thinking, like the Global Fragility Act, for example, where we love to support the wider team in the agency and how we tackle those. And honestly, as far as the team goes, while we do have some of this foundational strategic work to put in place, we're really anxious to be able to kind of reach out to the field and work with our missions on improving some of the practices and getting a good sense of the great initiatives that are already in place, like Juan's been able to speak about with InfoSegura. So yeah, we have our work cut out for us, but this helps.
Well, we were very happy that you brought together this conversation. I mean, I think it's a testament to the really collaborative spirit that CVP is entering into this space with, that they brought together a lot of people, PeaceCon, to talk about their work, and that there's a lot of dialogue going on. There's a lot of learning going on, and we look forward to working with you. So there's data, there's cards from Alexa, there's observatories and data literacy from Clina, there's Building Back Better from InfoSegura, and we've got the One Earth Foundation report and the new stuff with Irene from Jessica. We hope all of that is useful to you at USAID, and we know there's a lot of work ahead of you, but we look forward to working with you. So I wish everybody a happier new year, and look forward to all this progress in the next year. So thank you all very much.
Thank you.